So this is week 3 of our Walking with Jesus sermon series. As we continue the walk with Jesus, we see the disciples stumble a bit. Really, they've stumbled a good deal along the way, and Jesus keeps helping them back up. The more we go through these readings, the more I've moved from picturing it as a man or a woman walking side by side with Jesus to Jesus holding our hands as we go step by step, like a parent holding a child's hand as they first learn to walk. Have you ever wanted to ask someone a question or a favor and the right opportunity just never came up? You waited and waited, but you had to ask, and you finally just inserted it when you could, and it ended up sounding all the worse because of the timing. That's what is happening with James and John right here, on top of the fact that it's a pretty tactless question. There is a little bit of text between today's reading and last week's reading. In the lines that we jumped, Jesus predicts his own death. Just one verse before today's reading, Jesus says that he will be mocked, spit upon, flogged, and killed. Immediately after, in the text, James and John request positions of honor. I sincerely hope that there was more of a time gap between these two stories than what we see here. If not, either James and John completely missed the point of what Jesus was telling them, or they were enough of blockheads not to realize that they were basically asking for a front row seat to Jesus' death. The way that they start the request is a bit under...
Goes down.
The microphone's on.
It's good. It's good.
You all can hear me all right?
Yes. Okay.
So the way they start the request is a bit underhanded. It feels slimy. Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask you. They know that they're about to ask something that they probably shouldn't be. They're trying to get Jesus to agree to the request before they actually ask it. It's like when someone asks you, can you do a favor for me? If you say sure without knowing what the favor is, you're kind of stuck if it's a favor that you can't actually complete or that you would have difficulty doing. That's what they're trying to do to Jesus, get him committed before actually asking the question. Just like how I like to respond with the question, that depends, what kind of favor? Jesus answers them with the question of, what do you want me to do for you? They ask a very bold and, due to the timing, pretty crass favor of sitting at his right and left hand. Historically, where you were seated at the table had a lot of significance. Usually the host would sit at the head of the table, and then the more honored guest would sit to the right and left. The more important you were, the closer to the host you would sit, and the less important you were, the further down the table you would be. It was the same idea of importance of where you were seated that Jesus was referencing in Luke, when he said that you should seat yourself at the lowest place in the table, so that if the host wanted you closer, they would ask you to sit closer and you would be honored, whereas opposed to sitting too high at the table and being asked to reseat yourself lower and being shamed. Maybe the sons of thunder were daydreaming about glory during this discussion, since they asked to be seated in the positions of highest honor. Maybe they were just trying to be sneaky and figured that if they asked for the seats of honor now, they could avoid all the musical chairs and just cut straight to being told that they could have those seats of honor. All throughout Mark, Jesus has been talking about the first being last and the last being first. James and John just aren't getting it and are thinking about the glory. Jesus demonstrates patience with them. Instead of telling them that they're knuckleheads and needed to clean their ears out and actually listen to what he's saying, he approaches the request with compassion. You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I will be baptized with? The cup stands for all the suffering that he will endure. Jesus knows how much pain and suffering he's going to go through, and doesn't wish them to suffer that as well. Even Even Jesus himself prays to be spared that up. If Jesus wanted to be spared it, how much more would he want to spare James and John? They naively say that they can, and Jesus tells them that they will indeed suffer like him. We see in Acts 12:2, where James is martyred in Jerusalem by Herod Agrippa. I imagine Jesus holding back tears of sorrow as he tells them that their foolishly requested wish will be fulfilled, knowing the full extent of the pain that they were going to go through. I was reminded a lot of the monkey's paw story, or the adage, be careful what you wish for. I was thinking of putting a story along those lines in here and tying it into the scripture. But the more I thought about it, the less that it just didn't quite seem to fit. In those examples, a frivolous wish or request leads to disaster. For example, the first wish that the man in the monkey's paw story makes is money to pay off his mortgage. The next day, the son dies in an accident at the company that he worked for, and the company pays him exactly the amount that he wished for. While James and John don't realize the full extent of what they're asking for, the full extent of what they're agreeing to, when they say that they can drink the cup that Jesus will drink, and they do indeed suffer for that request, it's not quite the same. In stories like the monkey's paw, no good comes from their wish. In James and John's case, however, the pain and suffering that they endure is for the sake of following and sharing Jesus' teachings. They die as martyrs, not trying to sate their own greed or desires. For them, it's a redeeming quality. They ask out of pride. During the Passion, they even abandon Jesus. But they and their faith grow, and they share in the suffering of Jesus for the sake of others. Jesus tells them, though, that he can't grant the request to be at the right and left hand. That's not his to grant, but is for those for whom it's been prepared. Especially since this follows so shortly after he's predicted his own death. This could be a reference to the two criminals that are crucified with Jesus. It could also be a reference that only God determines who will share in Jesus' glory. The rest of the disciples get wind of James and John's requests, and they aren't too happy about it. They get angry with James and John. How dare they ask for a spot of honor? Especially with how Jesus talks to them, I'm betting the reason that they were upset was because they had hoped for that seat themselves and didn't want James and John taking it from them. I guess it wasn't just James and John who weren't paying enough attention to what Jesus has been telling them. I could see the person in this picture with his hand in his head, or his head in his hand, being Jesus, frustrated with the disciples not listening yet again. Jesus tries to drive the point home for them by comparing how the Gentiles in power will lord it over others, but how it should be the opposite for them. It's interesting how Jesus says this, though. Those who they recognize as rulers lord it over them. In the NIV, it reads, those who are regarded as rulers. This implies that they're not actually true rulers, that they're pretenders. The word used for Lord, when they're saying they lord it over them, uses the same root word as the word for the real Lord. This further shows the contrast between the Gentiles' great false rulers being tyrants over the people, and those who become great for the Lord being servants. Even more, if you wish to be first, you must be slave to all. Jesus keeps trying to get this to sink in to the disciples that follow him, that accepting God, inheriting eternal life, it's all about humility and service, not about gaining glory for yourself. This focus on servitude distinguishes Jesus' new order from many of the prophets' apocalyptic visions. Those would often show the afflicted and suffering as triumphing over their oppressors and ruling over them. Jesus is trying to get them to fully understand that he came to serve, not to be served, and to give his life to save everyone else's. Tying back to Jesus saying that James and John will share his cup, there is a big distinction between Jesus' death and the martyred disciples. While they may share in the suffering and service to others, they neither do nor can offer their own life as a sacrifice for he had another friend that he had been friends with for most of his life, and that they had been roommates with for quite some time. The decision made sense, and I wasn't offended by having him pick someone else as the best man. There are many important roles that a best man should fill. The best man should be the one the groom turns to for comfort and support throughout the entire wedding planning. He should help coordinate with vendors, take part in selecting venues, and offering opinions for other details. In short, the best man's job is to help make sure that everything runs smoothly and to ease the groom's stress. The best man at his wedding did none of this. I didn't realize just how little the best man had done until the day of the wedding, when Nick asked me to help him with getting some chairs delivered to the venue. I tried to coordinate with the best man and learned that he had no idea of what was going on and was planning on getting there just in time for the pictures, and hadn't planned on helping with the setup or the teardown at all. Nick was getting very stressed and worried and wasn't able to enjoy the day like he should be able to. He was getting married at really late in Estes Park, and the logistics were a nightmare. I got the information that I needed, which mostly consisted of who was supposed to be doing what and phone numbers for everyone, and then promptly went into a frenzy trying to get everything running smoothly. I commandeered a few people to help me, and we got the chairs delivered and set up, as well as the arch. We directed everyone to the right location, and even hunted down one attendee that went to the wrong lake. We got the family back to where the wedding was supposed to be taking place, which involved shuttling several people down a narrow, one-lane dirt road, almost a mile away. We got everyone where they were supposed to be when they were supposed to be there. All this we managed with almost no cell phones either, since there was no service at the lake. When Nick showed up, he couldn't believe how smoothly things were going. I could see him visibly start to relax and start enjoying himself. The wedding went off without a hitch, and we made him go straight to the reception. Let us take care of the teardown. Once we got to the reception, we escorted people to where they were supposed to be, helped get the drinks and food set up. And at the end of the evening, I drove them home so that they didn't need to worry about if they were okay to drive or not. I was a bit disappointed that I didn't get to relax and enjoy myself as much as I had hoped. I was exhausted by the end of the night. It was well worth it though, since Nick got to stop stressing and enjoy his wedding. Yes, I had wanted to just relax and have a fun time, but this was supposed to be my friend's wedding day, his big day. It wasn't about me. I put my own desires aside and did everything I could to help him. While his other friend may have been, or had the title of best man, both Nick and his wife agreed that I was the unofficial best man. I may not have had the seat of honor. I may not have got to stand right by my friend's side during the wedding. But what I did for him that day meant more for him than anything his best man did for him. I was willing to put aside my own wants and pride and serve. And that service raised me up in greatness in Nick and his wife's eyes. I reached those heights of greatness just by serving my friend. In the grand scheme of things, it was a relatively small service, done for a single person that I cared about. How much greater could we become if we were willing to become servants like that every day? And not just to the people that we personally are invested in, but to all. While the rewards would be much higher, it is also much harder to do so. It's a lot easier to go out of your way and help someone that you care about, a friend. It's a lot harder to do so for a complete stranger, or for someone who's been less than kind to you. Jesus says that if we wish to become first, we must become slave to all. After all, Jesus came not just for the sake of those close to him, but for all of humanity. It's very easy for us reading to look at the disciples and wonder just how thick-headed they are, just how many times Jesus has to reiterate himself, why they can't just seem to understand. I genuinely appreciate the disciples' repeated struggles with and for honor. Hearing or reading what Jesus says about if you wish to become great, you must be a servant, or if you wish to become first, you must be a slave to all. That's easy. Truly accepting and living that is a difficult task. Like the disciples, even though I have heard it many times and know that I should do it, it's easy for me to slip and put myself first. Like the disciples, I need to keep being reminded over and over again. And I'm sure glad that Jesus is as patient with me as he was with James and John. Far too often, Christians can fall into the idea that we're somehow better than others because we've accepted God. Too often, we try to lord it over them. To quote a song by Weird Al, "Think you're really righteous, think you're pure in heart. Well, I know I'm a million times as humble as thou art." If we're lording it over others, we become no better than the tyrants that Jesus warned against. Or still, we miss the point. A servant or a slave doesn't lord it over those that they serve. We need to serve with humility. Again, this is a challenge for most people. Even in the situation with my friend's wedding, I have to fight the urge to brag about what I did. You could probably see that a little bit when I was saying everything that I had done. I'm not about to go full tyrant and go to his other friend and tell him how much better of a best man I would have been. But even the more subtle acts of vanity are still, in a way, lording it over others. There is a greedy, selfish part of me that reveled in the praise that they gave me and wanted to hear more. Wanted to hear them tell me how I had single-handedly saved their wedding and that it would have all fallen apart if it weren't for me, which of course wouldn't have been the case. I have to work hard to keep that glory-seeking part of me in check. With God's guidance and help, I'm usually able to do so. I do have to keep getting set straight from time to time, just like the disciples did. It's not easy to set aside yourself and fully serve God, God's kingdom and all of God's people. Just like the disciples, we need reminding again and again. Just like the disciples, we find ourselves falling back into the same old patterns of trying to be first, wanting to be the greatest. With the help of the disciples, Jesus reminds us time and time again that the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. With the help of the disciples, Jesus shows us that truly following him is a life of humble servitude. So when you find yourself struggling to serve, as Jesus calls us, remember that when the 12 struggled with this and had to be reminded over and over, like Bob Dylan said, you're going to have to serve somebody. So let us seek the opportunity to serve God, because there is no more loving, caring, and good master than God.